The Apache warrior Nakai didn't believe in ghosts, but he saw one in the sun-bleached street of a town called Prosperity Gulch. It wasn't a spirit that stopped the breath in his lungs. It was the ghost of a memory, hanging from the thin neck of a starving child. There, against the pale skin of a girl he'd never seen, was a single stone of turquoise, carved into the shape of a falcon in flight. The very same necklace he had carved for his daughter, Ayana, the day the world ended. That day was a nightmare of fire and screams. A militia had fallen upon his people like a plague, and they had taken everything. His wife, Nidita, whose laugh was the sound of a running stream, and Ayana, his 6-year-old girl, whose small hand was a phantom weight he still felt in his own. All he had left was the silent winter in his soul and an identical turquoise falcon he wore beneath his shirt, a cold comfort against his skin. He had wandered for years, not as a warrior seeking revenge, but as a hollow man, sifting through the dust of the world for a piece of his own heart. Prosperity Gulch was a cruel joke of a name for a town that was actively dying. Its buildings sagged like tired old men. The earth was cracked and thirsty, just like the faces of the people who called it home. And it was here, in the sliver of shade by the blacksmith's forge, that fate finally showed its hand. He saw the girl as a flicker of movement at the edge of the town square. She was maybe 10 years old with bones as fragile as a bird's. The other children, plump and loud, kept their distance, their whispers like the sting of thrown stones. She was an outcast. Her name, he would learn, was Abigail Finch, the orphan of a miner who'd chased luck to the bottom of a collapsed shaft. But it wasn't her hunger that snared Nakai's gaze and held it hostage. It was the sudden glint of impossible blue against her collarbone. The world narrowed to that single point of color. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer faded. The dust in his mouth was forgotten. There was only the falcon. Its stone wings spread, soaring over a landscape of impossible grief. It couldn't be, and yet it was. Hope surged through him like a violent, painful flood, a drowning man's first gasp of air that burns the lungs. It was followed by a cold wave of fear. For years, his search had been a thing of abstract faith. Now it had a face, and that face belonged to a stranger. He pushed himself away from the wall, his movements slow, deliberate. Every instinct honed by a life of survival was now focused on not startling this fragile child, but his very presence was a disturbance. In this town, an Apache was not a man. He was an omen. The townsfolk paused. Conversations died. A woman pulled her child close. The sheriff, a hard-faced man named Elias Thorne, shifted his weight, his hand drifting to rest on the worn leather grip of his revolver. The air grew thick with suspicion. The children scattered like quail as Nakai closed the distance, his shadow falling over the girl. Abigail looked up, her eyes wide with the primal fear of a cornered animal. He stopped before her, a silent mountain of a man, his face a mask of questions too deep for words. He didn't speak. He simply raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and pointed. Not at the girl, but at the piece of his soul she wore around her neck. His eyes, dark with a sorrow that transcended language, asked the only question that mattered. Who are you? The silence that stretched across the dusty street was a living thing, heavy and sharp. The townsfolk had become a gallery of hardened faces, their eyes fixed on the silent exchange between the warrior and the orphan. Sheriff Thorne's hand remained a breath away from his weapon, a silent promise of violence. But the spell wasn't broken by a threat. It was broken by the creak of a door from the general store. A woman appeared, her face a roadmap of hardship. This was Adeline Finch, the aunt who had taken Abigail in. She was a plain woman, her hands chapped from lye soap, but her eyes held a weary intelligence. She saw Nakai. She saw the raw, unshielded pain in his gaze. And then she saw the necklace he wore, the twin to the one on her niece's neck. A small, wounded gasp escaped her lips, and the color drained from her face. It wasn't fear that seized her. It was recognition, so profound it seemed to shake the very foundations of her world. The town looked to her, sensing the answer to the riddle lay with her. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin but clear, cutting through the tension like a shard of glass. She didn't speak to the crowd, but directly to Nakai. She began a story that silenced every whisper. She spoke of her brother, Abigail's father, a good man whose luck was always thin. Years ago, while prospecting in the foothills, he had found a woman at the edge of a dry creek bed, delirious and near death. Her memory had been burned away by sun and trauma. She was Apache, that much was clear. But she knew no name, no past, no people. All she had was the necklace she clutched in her hand, the one with the turquoise falcon. He had brought her back, nursed her to health. In the absence of a past, they had built a future. She took a new name, Sarah, and in time she became his wife. A year later, their daughter Abigail was born. As Adeline spoke, Nakai's stoic mask began to crack. Each word was a hammer blow. The woman she described, it was Nadita. The timeline, the location, the necklace. It was all a perfect, terrible fit. The world tilted beneath his feet. His wife had lived. She had survived the raid. A fierce, impossible joy crashed through him, followed immediately by an abyss of grief so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. She had lived, but not for him. She had built a new life, found a new love, and borne another man's child. All while he wandered the wilderness, married only to her memory. Adeline's story continued, her voice softening with sorrow. She explained that a fever had taken both Sarah and her husband 2 winters past, leaving Abigail an orphan in her care. The necklace, she confessed, was the only thing Abigail had of her mother. Then she recalled a detail she had never understood. Her sister-in-law, the woman who called herself Sarah, would often stare towards the eastern mountains for hours, humming a melody without words. Sometimes she would draw symbols in the dust with a stick, patterns that looked like birds or arrows, symbols she would quickly erase if anyone saw. Nakai recognized it instantly. It was the lullaby he had sung to Ayana. Those were the clan symbols of his own people. Nidita's memory had not been entirely gone. It was a prisoner in her own mind, a ghost whispering of a life she could no longer name. The revelation was complete, a truth more brutal than a blade. His quest was over. Ayana, his Ayana, was truly gone. Nidita had survived only to be lost to him again, this time to a life he never knew, in a grave he had never visited. And this child, this pale, frightened girl, was not his daughter. But she was the last living piece of the woman he had loved, a living echo of a life stolen from them both. He looked at Abigail, who stared back, her fear now mingled with confusion. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of Nidita's strength. The townsfolk watched, waiting. The sheriff's hand had not moved. Before Nakai lay 2 paths, the familiar desolate road of a man haunted by ghosts, or the unknown territory of a man bound to protect the living echo of a love he thought was lost forever. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt. The simple act of kneeling shattered the tension, replacing it with a profound, unsettling quiet. It was not the posture of a warrior, nor the submission of a captive. It was the gesture of a man lowering himself to meet the gaze of a child. Abigail, who had been ready to bolt, found her feet rooted to the spot, her fear eclipsed by curiosity. Sheriff Thorne's hand slowly moved away from his pistol. The townspeople murmured, their certainty shaken. They had expected violence. They did not know what to make of this quiet display of grief. Adeline Finch, however, understood. She saw past the warrior's build to the broken heart beneath. She stepped forward, breaking the invisible circle of fear around the child, and placed a trembling hand on Abigail's shoulder. Her gaze met Nakai's, and in that look, a fragile truce was forged. With a quiet word to her niece, Adeline turned and began walking toward her small house at the dusty edge of town. She did not invite Nakai with words, but her deliberate pace and a single glance back over her shoulder were an unmistakable summons. He rose, his movements fluid and silent, and followed. The crowd parted for him, their suspicion now mixed with a grudging awe. Adeline's home was small and worn, but immaculately clean. For Nakai, who was used to the infinite ceiling of the sky, the low roof felt like a cage. Abigail stayed close to her aunt, her eyes tracking his every move. Adeline gestured for him to sit at the small pine table, a gesture he ignored, choosing to stand where he could see the open land through the doorway. It was then that Adeline brought out a small, battered wooden box. This, she explained, was all her sister-in-law had with her when she was found. It held the entire contents of the life she couldn't remember. Adeline opened the lid. Inside was a collection of small, random objects. A strangely shaped river rock, a blue jay's feather, a pressed desert marigold, brittle with age. But nestled in a corner, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, was a single flat stone no bigger than his thumb. Adeline confessed she never knew its meaning, only that Sarah would hold it for hours, rubbing its surface until it was smooth. Nakai reached for it, his hand steady despite the tremor in his soul. He turned it over. Faintly etched into the stone was the symbol of a winding river meeting a mountain peak. It was the mark of their marriage bond, a secret vow carved on a stone from the very stream where he had first told Nadita of his love. She hadn't remembered his face or his name, but some part of her, deep in the silent, wounded chambers of her soul, had remembered their promise. A single hot tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. This was a sign. He was exactly where he was meant to be. But as he looked closer in the box, his eyes caught on something else. A small, crude carving, tucked beneath the feather. It was made of soft wood, whittled by an unsteady hand. It wasn't a falcon. It was a coyote. The image sent a chill through him. The coyote was a trickster, a bad omen. Why would Nadita, a woman of the Falcon clan, possess such a thing? The moment of connection was shattered by this new jarring mystery. What other secrets had his wife carried? The question was interrupted by the heavy tread of boots on the porch, followed by a sharp knock on the door. Sheriff Thorne filled the doorway, his presence sucking the warmth from the small room. His gaze took in the scene. Adeline's tear-streaked face, the open box, and Nakai standing like a stone sentinel, holding the marriage rock in one hand and the strange coyote carving in the other. Thorne was not an evil man, but a pragmatic one. He acknowledged Adeline's story, which was already spreading through town like wildfire, but made it clear that a tragic past did not grant a free pass. An Apache warrior on the edge of town was a spark near a powder keg. He stepped forward, his voice low. He spoke of the town's own troubles. A mountain lion, old and cunning, had been preying on their livestock for months, a ghost in the rocks that no one could track. It was bolder now, its kills moving closer to the town's edge. "You want a place here?" the sheriff stated, his words a direct challenge. "Then you'll give this town a reason to want you. Staring at the past won't feed this child." He looked from Nakai to Abigail, his meaning clear. "The town offers a bounty for that lion's pelt. You will hunt this shadow. You will remove the threat it poses to this community. Consider it the price for our tolerance. You succeed, and perhaps we'll see you as something other than a ghost. You fail or refuse, and this town will have no place for you." Nakai looked from the sheriff's hard face to the small, unsettling coyote in his hand. The lion was a threat he could understand. But this carving, it felt like the track of a different kind of predator, one far more dangerous. He accepted the sheriff's challenge with a slow, deliberate nod. The language of the hunt was one he spoke fluently, but he was beginning to realize he might be hunting more than just a lion. As the sun rose the next morning, he was already gone, melting into the landscape. He left with nothing but a knife, a water skin, and the clothes on his back. A stark contrast to the townsmen who had previously hunted the beast with heavy rifles and clumsy determination. For them, the wilderness was an adversary. For Nakai, it was a living text, filled with stories waiting to be read. He did not begin by searching for tracks. He began by listening. He climbed a high ridge and opened his senses, searching for a discordant note in the hum of life. A pocket of silence where there should be sound. The fear of a great predator leaves a vacuum in its wake. Days turned into a week. Back in Prosperity Gulch, the whispers began to change. A local rancher named Jed Miller, who had lost a half-dozen sheep, had taken to watching Nakai from afar through a spyglass. He reported what he saw to the men in the saloon. He spoke of how the Apache seemed to draw water from dry rock, how he moved through dense brush without a sound. The talk of Nakai as a danger slowly gave way to a grudging respect. For Nakai, this was a return to the self he had been before grief hollowed him out. He found the lion's trail not in soft earth, but in places others overlooked. A single dark hair snagged on a juniper branch, a faint scrape on a granite slab. The trail told a story of desperation. The kills were sloppy. A healthy lion was a creature of patient power. This one was something else. The townsman saw a monster. Nakai saw an animal in pain. He followed the trail not to where a predator would hunt, but to where a wounded creature would hide. In a patch of hardened mud near a seep of alkali water, he found the truth. A partial paw print, deeper than the others, and in it, the unmistakable imprint of a festering wound. Later that day, he found the source, a rusted piece of a steel trap half buried in the sand. The lion wasn't just old, it was crippled, its paw mangled by the forgotten cruelty of man. It was killing livestock because it was no longer fast enough to hunt wild deer. This was no longer a hunt. It was a mercy. He tracked the lion to its final refuge, a narrow cave set high in a tumble of sun-scorched boulders. He could smell the sickness on the wind. He prepared himself not for a fight, but for a solemn, necessary act. As he moved silently toward the mouth of the cave, his knife gripped in his hand, a shout shattered the stillness. "There he is! Cornered it for us!" Nakai froze. Scrambling up the rocks behind him were three men, their faces flushed with whiskey. Leading them was Jed Miller, his face a permanent sneer of resentment. They raised their rifles, their movements clumsy and loud. Jed grinned, a cruel, triumphant look in his eye as he leveled his rifle not at the cave, but at Nakai himself. "Well, look at that," Jed's voice echoed in the canyon. "Took you long enough. Step aside, Apache. This is justice for the town, and we'll deliver it ourselves." Before Nakai could react, a low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness of the cave. It was the sound of pure misery. The sound sent a jolt of panic through Jed's two companions. One of them fired his rifle blindly. The shot went wide, ricocheting off the rock face with a high-pitched scream. That was the final trigger. With a deafening roar of pain, the mountain lion exploded from the cave. It was a terrifying whirlwind of tawny fur and teeth, its movements made frantic by the mangled paw it couldn't put weight on. It wasn't charging to kill. It was a desperate, blind flight for survival, directly into the path of the men who had cornered it. Jed, standing closest, froze, his face a mask of terror. Time seemed to slow for Nakai. He saw the inevitable outcome. A man mauled, a panicked animal shot, and left to die a slower, more agonizing death. In that split second, Nakai acted. He moved like the wind, closing the distance in two powerful strides. Ignoring the lion, he threw his entire body into Jed, a hard impact that sent them both tumbling sideways down a short, steep embankment of loose rock, just as the lion flashed through the space where Jed had been standing. The creature, its escape route now clear, scrambled past them and disappeared into the labyrinth of canyons. The silence that returned was heavier than before, broken only by ragged, panicked breathing. Jed lay on the ground, stunned. As Nakai pushed himself up, his eyes scanned the ground where they had fallen. The impact had shaken loose the contents of Jed's pockets. Among the scattered cartridges, a piece of metal glinted in the sunlight. Nakai reached down and picked it up. It was the other half of the rusted steel trap. The jagged break in the metal was a perfect match to the piece he had found by the spring. The entire ugly story clicked into place. Jed was not just the lion's chief victim. He was its creator. His illegal, carelessly placed trap had crippled the animal. His obsessive public hatred was not born of righteous anger, but of the festering guilt of a man who had caused the very problem he couldn't solve. Nakai rose to his feet, the two pieces of the broken trap resting together in his palm. He walked over to Jed, who was just sitting up, his arrogance shattered. Nakai did not utter a single word. He simply opened his hand. The color drained from Jed's face as he stared at the evidence of his secret shame, now laid bare in the hand of the man who had just saved his life. For the first time, the bluster in his eyes was replaced by humiliation and a sliver of raw respect. "It's still out there," he rasped, looking at Nakai. "Wounded. Mad. You know where it'll go now, don't you?" It was an admission of defeat. The grim task lay ahead. Nakai, with Jed and his humbled friends following like chastened boys, tracked the bleeding lion. It was not a long journey. The creature had sought a dark, quiet place to meet its end. He went into the final den alone. The sounds from within were brief. The silence that followed was one of profound finality. When he emerged, he carried not a trophy, but the weight of a necessary duty. But inside the den, among the scattered bones of the lion's meager meals, something else caught his eye. Half buried in the dirt floor was a small, tattered scrap of red cloth. He pulled it free. It was coarse, sun-faded, and stitched onto it, in bleached white thread, was a symbol, a coyote's skull. A cold dread washed over him. This symbol was the mark of the marauders, the disbanded militia who had burned his village, the same men who had taken Nadita. The lion hadn't just been crippled by a rancher's forgotten trap. It had survived an encounter with the ghosts of his past, and the coyote carving in the Nadita's box was no longer a mystery. It was a warning. The danger hadn't ended years ago. It had followed him here. Their return to Prosperity Gulch was quiet. Jed, stripped of his bravado, told the truth. He told Sheriff Thorne about the illegal trap, about his foolish pride, and about how the Apache had saved his life from a disaster of his own making. The story spread, not with the speed of gossip, but with the slow certainty of a changing season. Nakai was no longer just the stranger. He was the man who had faced the town's beast and shown more honor than their own. But Nakai's mind was elsewhere. He did not present the lion's pelt. He laid the tattered scrap of red cloth on the sheriff's desk. Next to it, he placed the small wooden coyote carving from Nadita's box. Thorne stared at the symbol, his face hardening. He recognized it. Rumors of the coyote skulls had drifted through the territory for years, a plague of ghosts who hit hard and vanished. Seeing the symbol here, connected to a local rancher's trap and a dead woman's secret possessions, turned a distant threat into an immediate one. That evening, Nakai went to Adeline's house. He didn't ask. He demanded. He placed the carving on her small kitchen table, and his voice was low and dangerous. "Tell me the rest of the story." Adeline flinched, her weary face crumbling into fear. The truth came out in a torrent of whispered confessions. She had lied. Not about everything, but about the most important part. Her brother, Abigail's father, hadn't found Nadita alone. He wasn't just a simple prospector. He had been one of them, a member of the Coyote Skull militia. His name was Thomas Finch, and he had been there the day Nakai's village burned. But the slaughter had broken something in him. Riddled with guilt, he had deserted, taking the traumatized, amnesiac woman with him as a desperate, selfish act of penance. He had given her a new name and a new life, a life built on a foundation of blood and lies. The coyote carving wasn't Nadita's. It was his, a reminder of the life he'd fled. The world buckled under Nakai's feet. Nadita hadn't chosen a new life. She'd been stolen by one of her attackers. And Abigail was the daughter of one of the men who had destroyed his world. This innocent child, the last living piece of his wife, was a legacy of the very evil that had shattered his soul. The conflict within him was a silent, screaming war. But Adeline wasn't finished. Before Thomas died from the fever, he had confessed one last thing. He had told her the coyote skulls were still looking for him, not just for deserting, but because he had stolen something from them when he fled. He didn't know what it was, only that their leader was obsessed with it, and that it was hidden in the one thing the Apache woman never let out of her sight, the turquoise falcon necklace. Nakai's gaze snapped to Abigail, who was sleeping in a small cot in the corner, the blue stone rising and falling with her gentle breaths. The necklace wasn't just a memory, it was a map, a key. It was the reason the ghosts of his past were closing in. And the child, his child in all but blood, was wearing it like a target. He now understood. The marauders weren't just a random threat. They were coming here. They were coming for the necklace. The calm was shattered by the frantic, rhythmic pounding of a horse's hooves, growing rapidly louder. It was the sound of a desperate flight. A lone man on a lathered horse burst into the town's main street, pulling his mount to a skidding halt. He was a trapper, his face pale with terror. He shouted of a group of men he'd seen in the Western Pass, more than a dozen of them, riding hard. They were not cowboys or soldiers. They rode under a crude banner, a tattered red flag bearing the bleached white symbol of a coyote's skull. The ghosts were no longer memories. They were riding on the wind, and they were coming to finish what they had started. Panic, ugly and chaotic, swept through Prosperity Gulch. Men grabbed old rifles, shouting conflicting plans. Sheriff Thorne tried to impose order, but he was one man against a tide of terror. The town was preparing for its own funeral. Into this chaos, Nakai walked. He emerged from the shadows, not as an outsider, but as an anchor in the storm. He moved with a calm, lethal purpose that cut through the hysteria. He went directly to Thorne, and the men around them fell silent. In Nakai's gaze there was no fear, only a cold, focused determination. This was his fight. He was no longer a wandering man haunted by the past. He was a protector of the present. His voice was low and steady, carrying an authority no one dared question. He told them a stand in the open street would be a slaughter. Their only chance was the land itself. He became their strategist, their warrior chief. His knowledge of the terrain was now their single greatest weapon. He directed the handful of able-bodied men, with Jed Miller at his side, his rifle held with a new, sober resolve. They abandoned the vulnerable town center, fortifying the narrow passes and rocky choke points in the canyons. They created rock slides and concealed rifle positions, turning the landscape into a series of deadly traps. While the men prepared for battle, Adeline led the women and children to the cold, dark silence of an abandoned silver mine deep in the hills. Abigail did not want to leave Nakai's side, her small hand clutching his. He knelt before her, and with a look that needed no words, promised he would not let the ghosts of his past touch her future. As he held her for a moment, his fingers brushed against the turquoise falcon. He had to know. He took the necklace and examined it under the fading light. His carver's hands, so familiar with its every line and curve, found what no one else ever had. A tiny, almost invisible seam. He twisted the falcon's head, and the stone body popped open on a minuscule hinge. Inside there was no map to gold. There was a single, tightly folded piece of dried hide. He carefully unfolded it. On it were not words, but a series of symbols: mountains, rivers, star patterns. It was a map, but a sacred one. A map to a hidden canyon, a place of legend known only to the elders of his tribe. The place his people called the Source, the site of a secret, untouched silver mine that was the heart of his clan's wealth and spirit. This is what they were after, not just revenge on a deserter. They wanted to bleed his people's legacy dry. A tense, expectant silence fell. The town became a ghost town, its defenders hidden in the rocks, waiting for the devil to arrive. They did not wait long. The marauders appeared at dusk, a dark tide of riders against the blood-red sunset. The coyote skull banner, a blasphemy against the sky. They rode with swaggering confidence, expecting an easy plunder. Their first charge into the main canyon was met not with panicked citizens, but with a disciplined volley of rifle fire from unseen positions. The surprise was total. The lead riders fell. The confident charge devolved into a confused, angry siege. But the marauders were veterans of this brutal work. They regrouped, and their counterattack was terrifyingly precise. They seemed to know the town's layout, setting fires to create smoke and chaos. From his vantage point, Nakai watched their leader, a man who directed the assault with hand signals, moving with the fluid grace of a hunter. As a tongue of flame lit the canyon, the leader's face was illuminated. Nakai's blood ran cold. It was Kale, an Apache scout from a neighboring clan, a man he had known, a man who had vanished weeks before the massacre of his people. The truth struck Nakai with the force of a physical blow. Kale hadn't been a victim of the militia. He had been their guide. The destruction of his home, the loss of Nadita and Ayana. It had not been a random atrocity. It had been a betrayal from within. This was not just a fight for survival. It had become a reckoning. Kale's tactics were brilliant and cruel. He was using his own people's knowledge of warfare against the town, flanking their positions, using the fire and smoke for cover. The defenders were holding, but they were outnumbered. The line was beginning to break. Nakai saw a group of marauders break through the eastern pass, heading directly for the hills that concealed the mine and the people he had sworn to protect. A direct fight was lost. Time was running out. He had to change the battle itself. He knew Kale. He knew his pride, his cruelty, his greed. But most of all, He knew that he, Nakai, was the last living witness to Kale's original sin. He was the one loose thread. In that moment, Nakai made his choice, a sacrifice. He broke from his cover, scrambling up the steep roof of the blacksmith's forge, the highest point in the town. He stood there, silhouetted against the roaring flames, a lone warrior against the encroaching darkness. He raised his head to the sky and let out a war cry, a sound of pure challenge that he knew Kale would recognize. Below, the chaos faltered. The traitorous scout stopped, his head snapping up. A slow, cruel smile of recognition spread across his face. He pointed a long, damning finger directly at Nakai, his voice cutting through the din as he barked an order to his men. "Forget the town. He is the one I want. Bring him to me alive." Kale's order turned the chaotic raid into a focused manhunt. The marauders, like wolves scenting blood, abandoned their plunder and converged on the blacksmith's forge. For them, Nakai was a cornered animal. But they were deeply mistaken. Nakai was not cornered. He was exactly where he wanted to be. He had drawn the enemy onto his chosen battlefield, a landscape of rooftops, smoke-filled alleys, and deep shadows that he understood far better than they did. As the first men scrambled onto the roof after him, he was already gone, a phantom leaping across the narrow gap to the general store. The town of Prosperity Gulch, once his prison of suspicion, now became his weapon. He led them on a deadly chase through the night, a ghost that materialized from the smoke only to disappear again. A rope stretched across a dark alley sent riders tumbling from their saddles. A carefully aimed rock sent a precariously balanced stack of barrels crashing down. This was not a fight of brute force, but of strategic superiority, and he was not alone. The men of the town, seeing his plan, rallied from their defensive positions. Led by Sheriff Thorne and a grimly determined Jed, they became the anvil to his hammer. When Nakai herded a group of marauders into the livery stable, Thorne's men were there to bar the doors, trapping them inside. Jed, using the tracking skills Nakai had unknowingly taught him, anticipated where a fleeing bandit would go and was there to meet him. The townspeople, once a scattered collection of fearful individuals, were now a cohesive fighting force, united by the man they had once shunned. One by one, the marauders were captured, disarmed, or sent fleeing. Their numbers crumbled under the relentless pressure. Finally, only one true threat remained. Kale, his face a mask of fury, dismounted and drew a long, wicked-looking blade. He would finish this himself. Nakai, watching from the shadows, knew this was the endgame. He allowed Kale to see him, a fleeting glimpse that drew the traitor into the cavernous, dark interior of the blacksmith shop. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. The only light came from the dying orange glow of the massive hearth. Kale lunged, his blade flashing. But Nakai did not meet force with force. He met it with wisdom. He used the forge itself, its hanging chains and heavy anvils, to evade and deflect, turning Kale's superior strength into a clumsy liability. Kale grew enraged. "She should have been mine," he snarled, his words dripping with the poison of old jealousy. "Nidita. But she chose you, the weak carver. I showed her what true strength was. I gave her to the militia, but I kept the secret of the silver for myself." He finally saw an opening, trapping Nakai against the great stone hearth and lunging forward for the killing blow. In that final moment, Nakai did not raise his knife to block. He sidestepped and threw his weight against the long wooden lever of the forge's great bellows. Instead of air, a massive cloud of superheated ash, soot, and glowing embers erupted from the hearth, blasting directly into Kale's face. He screamed in pure agony, dropping his knife as he clawed at his blinded eyes. His own forward momentum was his undoing. He stumbled blindly, crashing into a heavy iron rack of cooling tools, which toppled over and pinned him to the ground. Nakai had defeated him not with a weapon, but with a tool. He had used the heart of the town's industry to neutralize the threat. The fight was over. As Thorne and Jed rushed in to secure the writhing traitor, a heavy silence fell. The immediate danger had passed. But as they tied Kale's hands, he turned his sightless face towards Nakai, a venomous sneer on his lips. "This changes nothing," he rasped. "The men who hired me, they want that silver. They know about your bloodline. The first time was for your land. This time was for the map. They are still looking for the last son of Tone. A cold dread settled in the air. Kale was only a symptom. The true disease, a faceless enemy from Nakai's past, was still out there. The fires of the raid eventually burned out, and in their place, a new kind of warmth settled over Prosperity Gulch. The months that followed were a time of healing, not just for the town's charred buildings, but for its wounded spirit. The air of suspicion was gone, replaced by a shared purpose. And at the center of this rebirth was Nakai. He was no longer the specter at the edge of town. He was its quiet, steady heart. He built a small, sturdy cabin for himself near Adeline's home, its timbers solid and rooted. A new, peaceful routine settled upon their small, unlikely family. In the mornings, he would teach Abigail the ancient art of carving, his large hands guiding her small ones. In the afternoons, their roles would reverse. Abigail, with a patient determination that reminded him so much of Nadita, would teach him to read from a worn-out book, her small finger tracing the strange black symbols. Adeline would watch them from the porch, a soft smile on her face, witnessing the mending of three broken souls into a single, stronger whole. The threat Cale had spoken of remained, a distant cloud on the horizon, but it was a fear for tomorrow. One day, Sheriff Thorne came to visit, not with a warning, but with a puzzle. Among the traitor Cale's possessions was a crudely drawn map, which the sheriff now unrolled on the table. It showed the region, marking his burned village with a cross and Prosperity Gulch with a circle. But there was a third marking, a location deep in the southern mountains, labeled only as the Source. It was what was drawn beside this location that made Nakai's breath catch. It was a falcon in the same distinct, soaring style as the one on the necklaces, and beside it, a name, Toan. It was the name of his grandfather, a great chief spoken of in legends, a uniter of tribes who had vanished from the world 2 generations ago. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The attack on his village hadn't just been for land or silver. Kale had been hired to hunt the last known descendant of Chief Tone. Nakai was not merely a warrior who had lost his family. He was the carrier of a powerful and sacred bloodline, a legacy he never knew he possessed. His wandering had not been aimless. It had been a subconscious journey back to a destiny that had been waiting for him all along. The necklace he had carved was more than a father's gift. It was an echo of his ancestry, a symbol of a great heritage that had refused to be extinguished. He looked at Abigail, who was now carefully carving a wing onto a small wooden hawk, and he understood. His purpose was not just to protect this child, who was the daughter of his heart, but to guard the future of a lineage that had survived fire, betrayal, and time itself. The sun began to set, casting a golden light over their small home. A sense of profound peace settled over Nakai, deeper than the mere absence of conflict. His long search for Ayana was over. His quest for vengeance was meaningless. He had been a ghost, haunted by a past he could not change. But here, in this dusty town that had once feared him, he had found a new life. Redemption is not always found in reclaiming what was lost. Sometimes it is found in the courage to build something new upon the ruins. Family is not a matter of blood alone, but of bonds forged in the fires of adversity. And home is not a place on a map, but a feeling of safety in the hearts of those you would lay down your life to protect. The future was uncertain. The whispers of a distant enemy were a reminder that the world was still a dangerous place. But for now, a warrior had found his purpose. A child had found her family. And in a forgotten corner of the vast and unforgiving West, a home had been made. Did you enjoy this journey? Let me know what part of the world you're watching this story from. Leave your comment below, and to make sure you don't miss the next adventure, don't forget to subscribe.